Over to you, Chair.
Good morning, sisters and brothers of the Caribbean Studies Association, friends and comrades. Bonjour, buenos dias. I am Don Rojas, Director of Communications and International Relations for the National African American Reparations Commission, also known by its acronym NARC, and I'll be your moderator for this President's Plenary on Reparations. I am joined today by four distinguished colleagues: Ambassador Dorbreen Ahmad from Antigua and Barbuda, Dr. Hilary Brown from the CARICOM Secretariat, Mr. Hans Fassler from Switzerland, and Mr. Eric Phillip from Guyana. In the first hour, each of our panelists will make back-to-back presentations, and in our second hour, we will entertain questions and brief comments from our virtual audience. First, a little historical background. The Caribbean Reparations Movement was launched at a Heads of Government Summit in Trinidad and Tobago in 2013 in response to the destructive impact that the long history of slavery and colonization had on the region, its diaspora, and its people. It was built on the principles of repair, reclaim, and restore what was forcibly taken from enslaved Africans by European colonizers and enslavers. The movement, diverse and all-encompassing in its demands for restorative action and repair, seeks an apology, establishment of appropriate social and economic infrastructures to support post-colonial states, and to repair the social and psychological damage caused in particular by colonialism and slavery. This plenary session will aim to respond to the following issues: the rationale and justification for the reparation movement, the diversity of key players involved, the movement's successes thus far, and what, if any, issues or actors have hindered its progress. Since I'm a Caribbean man myself, in exile, so to speak, here in the Washington-Baltimore metro area, allow me a few moments to tell you what the reparations movement in the United States has been doing, and it continues to grow by leaps and bounds. Reparations activities in one form or another are proliferating across the length and breadth of the country, from huge states like California and New York, to major cities like Chicago and Seattle, to municipalities like Evanston, Illinois, Asheville, North Carolina, and Providence, Rhode Island, among many others. From universities like Harvard and Georgetown to Christian, Jewish, and Muslim religious denominations, to the legacy civil and human rights organizations like the NAACP and the National Urban League, there are reparations initiatives and projects underway. Howard University in Washington and Columbia University in New York are partnering on an African American redress network, which so far has identified close to 400 unique reparations initiatives across the United States. In April 2015, the National African American Reparations Commission was launched at York College in New York at a National International Reparations Summit attended by advocates, academics, and activists from 22 countries in the Caribbean, Latin America, Europe, and Africa. Inspired by the formation of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, NARC has adopted a 10-point plan modeled from CARICOM's own 10-point plan. And several members of the CARICOM Commission attended the New York Summit and participated in a dialogue between the two commissions, which launched a close collaboration between the two bodies, a partnership that has grown stronger in the subsequent years and remains robust as we move together into 2021 and beyond. H.R. 40, the bill to establish a national commission to study the living legacies of slavery and examine various reparations proposals, is making its way through Congress under the leadership of Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee and is supported by 217 members of the House. A companion bill in the Senate, sponsored by Senator Cory Booker, enjoys the support of some 24 US senators, and that number is growing. The issue of reparations has moved rapidly from the fringes to the very center of civil and political discourse, especially in the post-George Floyd period of racial reckoning in the US. A highly anticipated new report released just this past Wednesday from California's first in the country statewide reparations task force details how slavery touched nearly every aspect of Black life in America, producing innumerable harms that are still felt today. The report offers a comprehensive look at the impacts of enslavement and generations of discrimination on Black Californians and on Black Americans more broadly. It finds that the damage to Black communities is extensive and that a variety of intentionally crafted policies, judicial decisions, and racism by private actors has created a widespread exclusion of Black people that has not been sufficiently addressed at any level of government. The California report covers not just the immediate impact of enslavement, but also the harms of decades of political neglect, finding that there has been sustained damage to generations of Black Americans. The damage has had a lasting effect on the political, economic, social, physical, mental, and cultural well-being of Black Americans, particularly those descended from the formerly enslaved. So having offered a brief report on the state of the reparations movement in the United States, let me now move directly to our panelists, beginning with Ambassador Dorbreen Omad of Antigua and Barbuda. He is one of the 3 vice chairs of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, with responsibility for the coordination of the activities of the national commissions and committees. He is also chairperson of the Antigua and Barbuda Reparations Support Commission, a body appointed by the government of Antigua and Barbuda since 2013. He was recently appointed ambassador at large with responsibilities for the National Reparatory Justice Program. Brother Omad is a cultural worker, an analyst, a lecturer, an author, playwright, director, and lyricist. He is a former chairperson of the Antigua Jazz Society and a radio TV program host in both jazz and calypso genres. His presentation will briefly scan the 21st century development of the Caribbean reparations movement with specific reference to the developments in the former British colonies and the creation of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, its structure and strategies, and its ideological evolution. Ambassador Dorbreen Omad, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Brother Don. Good day, good evening to everyone. In the few minutes allocated to me, I wish to do 2 things, perhaps 2 interrelated things. The first is to share information on how the CARICOM Reparations Commission, the CRC, functions, its structures and other operational details. And secondly, to examine the trajectory of reparations thought over the last decade as it evolved, at least in the former British colonies of the Caribbean, from one backgrounded by redress for the European genocide and slavery. I think of the modern Caribbean reparations movement as a 21st century expression. I'm not unmindful, however, of the history and recognize the foundations to this movement laid by scholars such as Nobel laureate Sir Lewis, who's reminded to Britain that it still had a debt to the Caribbean for 200 years of free labor that it received from this region. Foundations laid and established by many regional political leaders who succeeded in tackling colonialism and led us to independence. And although their expressions are not necessarily in the terms of reparatory justice as we now know them, they clearly challenged Britain of its cruelty in walking away at independence without even the common courtesy of what they referred to as a golden handshake. And just as importantly, the international work of Honorable Barbara Dudley Thompson, who in 1992 was empaneled as a member of the Organization of African Unity's Eminent Persons Group, charged with implementing the movement for reparations for slavery to African and African diaspora. And of course, of critical importance, the work of the Caribbean delegation led by Professor Hilary Beckles, present chairman of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, and Ambassador David Commission, now Barbados ambassador to CARICOM, at the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, known as the Durban Conference Against Racism in 2001, which issued a final declaration stating, "We acknowledge that slavery and the slave trade are a crime against humanity and should always have been so, especially the transatlantic slave trade, and are among the major sources and manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance." The declaration also recognized the victims of violations of their human rights as a result of racism and related wrongs should have the right to seek just and adequate reparations or satisfaction. The Durban Conference ended on the 8th of September 2001, and 3 days later, on September 11th, the attack on the World Trade Center in New York followed, which I think shifted the world's attention from the advancement in human rights considerations that were achieved in Durban. But the call for African unity and reparations specifically did not vanish. Rastafari groups, primarily in Jamaica, however, maintained the call for reparations, as did other organizations in the region. In 2003, the Pan-African Commission of the Government of Barbados staged a conference officially called African and African Descendants World Conference Against Racism to reassemble global reparation groups. The Global African Conference in 2004 staged a conference on racism in Suriname to unite efforts across the world to seek reparations from corporations and countries that were involved and enriched by slavery. In 2004, for the first time, a post-colonial government, that of Haiti, led by President Bertrand Aristide, made a formal request to an enslaving nation, France, for reparations, initiating a rather lengthy one-sided drama that ended with the invasion by French and US troops that removed, through kidnapping, President Aristide from office. Intimidating as the actions of the invaders were, regional focus on the injustice of the crimes against humanity and the crudeness and dismissal of the moral, legal, and political concerns for reparations resurfaced with passion and energy during the UN-sanctioned 2007 bicentennial commemoration and celebration of the abolition of the British Empire Atlantic slave trade, the Beast, where a mixture of governmental and non-governmental groups in Jamaica, in Antigua and Barbuda, in Barbados, and elsewhere across the region in Guyana, reignited this call. In July 2013, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Dr. the Honorable Hilary Gonzalez, placed the proposal before the Heads of Government Conference of the CARICOM that it should engage the United Kingdom, France, and Holland on the issue of reparations for native genocide and slavery. I think the publication of Dr. Beckles' book, Britain's Black Debt, must be highlighted as a major step in the evolution of the Caribbean reparations movement. The book was published in 2013, copies sent to all CARICOM prime ministers. It has presented and have provided for us an ideological direction of the movement. The minutes of the heads of government meeting reflect that the conference expressed unanimous support for the Gonzales initiative and agreed that the approach to be adopted at all levels should be more of the nature of development conversations than rather being confrontational. They also agreed to establish national committees on reparations where they did not exist. And three, agreed that a committee under the chairmanship of the Prime Minister of Barbados and comprising the chair of the conference and the heads of states and governments of Guyana, Haiti, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Suriname would oversee the work of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. The Prime Ministerial Committee is chaired presently by the Prime Minister of Barbados, Honorable Mia Mottley. Final decisions on matters of regional and international policy reside with the PMC, the Prime Ministerial Commission, and the heads of government. Herein lies, I think, one of the strengths of the regional reparations movement. It is authorized and backed by Caribbean sovereignty. Herein lies, I think, also one of its weaknesses, in that decision-making is not particularly speedy or flexible. The organizational structure, as visualized by the heads of government, is still current. It is a standard CARICOM structure that is applied in many different sectors and for many varied strategies. I think it's important that we understand that the strategies of the CRC are influenced by the structure of what is essentially a political framework, one which did not necessarily evolve from the needs of the strategy. The CRC is advisory to the PMC. It is neither positioned nor empowered with jurisdiction in terms of reference to circumvent or delegitimize actions of individual CARICOM sovereign states. It comprises the chairperson, Professor Hilary Beckles, the director of the Center for Reparations Research, that center established in 2017 at the UE campus on Mona, and the chairpersons of national committees and commissions existing in 11 of the 14 CARICOM states. No formal commissions have been established in Haiti, Belize, or Montserrat. Its diplomatic and financial interests are managed in the CARICOM Secretariat by the Secretariat's Program Manager for Culture and Community Development. The Commission meets quarterly and held its first in-person meeting since 2019, quite recently in March of this year in Barbados. As indicated earlier, the mandate for the CRC received from the heads of government emerged from consideration of two factors only: genocide and slavery. However, by September that year, 2013, at the first CARICOM Reparations Summit in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the mandate was expanded to call for the payment of reparations by the governments of all the former colonial powers and the relevant institutions in those countries to the nations and people of the Caribbean community for crimes against humanity of native genocide, the transatlantic slave trade, and a racialized system of chattel slavery. The crime of transatlantic slave trade, of the transatlantic slave trade, was added, and the number of target offenders expanded to all former colonial powers and relevant institutions in those countries. The CARICOM Justice Program was shaped then, and the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice issues. That plan outlines the path as seen by the CRC, the path to truth, to justice, and reconciliation. It is a development plan, as contrasted with the lineage plans that are developing elsewhere in the diaspora. It identifies the areas and or sectors of the regional development agenda where the injury and hurt caused by slavery, the slave trade, and genocide remain ongoing. And it further defined in broad terms the remedies proposed for healing. The plan provides the basis for reparatory justice negotiations between CARICOM and the European nations responsible for the damage. The second iteration of the plan, issued in 2017, made minor changes to the 2014 version, but addressed the following areas, and I list them very quickly. The plan, of course, is available on our the CRC website. Full formal apology, an Indigenous Peoples Development Program, repatriation, the establishment of cultural institutions, assistance in remedying the public health crisis, education programs, the enhancement of historical and cultural knowledge exchanges, psychological rehabilitation as a result of the transmission of trauma, the right to development through the use of technology, and the final point, debt cancellation and monetary compensation. The last CRC retreat mentioned in Barbados a few months ago decided that the 10-point plan should be reviewed. Two interrelated issues that developed from discussions over the years that have not been resolved are: one, the widening of the mandate to include the crime of colonialism, and two, the inclusion of a gender dimension in the 10-point plan. Two other emerging issues of more recent vintage, which are firmly in the CRC's orbit, are the issues of the indentureship of Asians and the climate justice. There's recognition within the Commission that both colonialism and post-colonial relationships were but a continuation of slavery and featured governance systems characterized by racism, by violence, and by broad human rights abuses. I think the conundrum within the CRC on this issue is no different than that of the OAU Eminent Persons Group, where, for example, Ajayi believed that reparations were also due for colonialism as it continued the worst characteristics of the slave trade. Honorable Dudley Thompson went further, asserting that Africans are owed reparations not only for colonialism, but also for the post-colonial period. Missouri, in opposing both views, felt that to extend the claim beyond slavery to colonialism would weaken the case for reparations. It makes it difficult to win on both by mixing the two, he is quoted as saying. The issues of indentureship and climate justice are poised for further study and research in the CIC. I think personally that they are challenged by the Missouri Doctrine, that the mixing of these issues with existing ones may make it more difficult to win, essentially on two counts. One, that the establishment of the crimes involved, the need to be established that the crimes involved were gross and systemic violations of human rights and or humanitarian law. And two, that the causal connections between the harm and identified past injustice is strong. The fourth issue, identified as being under consideration, is gender. There's no doubt that the experience of women in the slave trade during slavery and also during indentureship differed from that of men in the intensity of the harm perpetuated against them. And therefore, that existing contemporary women's justice issues would be better served through gender differentiated reparations measures. I here again issue in personal opinion that the issue of gender should be included in the CRC reparatory justice program. The resolution of these issues, I think the intensification of relationships with global reparations partners and improvement in our diplomatic overtures, I think then centers the CARICOM struggle firmly in the regional development agenda and definitely in the middle of the international human rights movement, challenging the practice of white supremacy in global affairs. I thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ahmad. Next up is Dr. Hilary Brown, who has been active in the field of regional development for the past 20 years and is currently the Program Manager, Culture and Community Development at the CARICOM Secretariat. In this position, Dr. Brown is responsible for development, advocacy, and integration with respect to the culture, youth, and gender programs in the CARICOM region. This includes the coordination of many regional activities, including the current initiative to pursue reparations for Native genocide and African slavery. Dr. Brown provides technical support to the CARICOM Reparations Commission, which reports to the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations, both established in 2013. Dr. Brown coordinated CARICOM's activities to mark the bicentennial of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in enslaved Africans in 2007, and has represented the region in a number of international meetings on slavery, racism, and the global African diaspora. Dr. Brown will be speaking to us today on the significance of CARICOM governments joining forces with civil society to advance the reparations claim, and she will also address some of the challenges faced by the CRC today. Dr. Brown, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Don. And thanks to Doreen for that really excellent overview of the development of thought on reparations. So in my presentation, as you said, I'm going to focus on confronting challenges and building coalitions for success. But first, let me express my sincere appreciation to the organizers of this 46th annual CSA conference and for inviting the CARICOM Reparations Commission to participate and present this panel on this important area to the community. And on my own part, I have to say what a pleasure it is to be back with CSA. I have attended CSA conferences in the past, and so I know it's excellent scholarship, excellent work that is always presented in this forum. So it's a pleasure to be back. I would first want to say that it was indeed a watershed moment in 2013 when the heads of government of CARICOM took the historic decision to pursue Europe for reparations on behalf of the people of the Caribbean. The crimes against humanity committed are indisputable. Over 150 years of European inflicted genocide on the indigenous people of the Caribbean, 300 years of the trade in enslaved Africans, chattel enslavement in the Caribbean, followed by what the Commission now calls deceptive indentureship of East Indian and Chinese migrants, and then another 100 years of debilitating colonialism, which Ambassador Ahmad covered very nicely. The debt has not yet been paid for systemic exploitation, extraction of wealth, pain and suffering, psychological harm, leading to the persistent poverty in the Caribbean up until today. And in order to address this history of exploitation, the descendants of the victims have issued a strident call for reparations, for restitution, for compensation, satisfaction, rehabilitation, and guarantees of non-repetition. The heads of government established the commission, comprised of the chairpersons of the National Reparations Committees, as you have heard, and with the UWI also as a founding member. And this action by governments in the region was a long time in coming, building on a very long-standing tradition of activism by Rastafari and other Pan-Africanists. The CARICOM Reparations Commission, since its establishment, can be said to have re-energized a global movement for reparatory justice and is providing intellectual leadership to the movement, especially through the work of the chair, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, Professor Vereen Shepherd, and in fact, all of the chairs of our committees are experts in their own right. But it can also be seen, in my view, and from where I sit in the CARICOM Secretariat, to be an issue that has given a boost to the regional integration movement, serving as a rallying cry and a call to action to heads of government, to our ministers of foreign affairs, our ministers of culture, a call against a common enemy, so to speak, to restore the dignity of the victims and their descendants, and to fight against racism and inequality. It is a recurring item on the agenda of heads of government, which usually inspires strong statements of support from most of our countries. CARICOM's initiative also inspired the establishment of the National African American Reparations Commission, which our moderator, Don Rowe, has spoke very well to. The CARICOM Commission's 10-point plan articulates the approach to reparations in a development framework and positions reparations as inextricably linked to our socioeconomic and cultural development. Further, this approach differs from those that focus on individual payments, because as you have heard, we are not looking at individual payments to the descendants of the enslaved or of the indigenous people, but looking at a broader development paradigm that will benefit the wider society. And I quote Professor Beckles, who said, reparations is not a handout. It is a just, deserved injection of resources to promote development and to bring about an end to white supremacist systems and practices. So the Commission over the past 9 years has focused on research, advocacy, public education, strategic partnerships with civil society, and youth engagement. The Commission holds the view that the social, economic, and environmental development challenges of the region, which have recently been exacerbated by the adverse effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, are rooted in these centuries of exploitation and must be repaired to secure a sustainable future for the region. The Caribbean, as you would know, is one of the highest indebted regions in the world, and this is further compounded by our extreme climate vulnerability. Reparatory justice is positioned within the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent as an indispensable human rights movement for social justice, dismantling of, oh, I thought you were raising your hand. Dismantling of structural racism and redress for systemic underdevelopment. The UN 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, which promises to leave no one behind and to reach the furthest behind first, is in the view of the CRC unattainable without global engagement to address systemic structures of inequality. However, the CRC recognizes that there are many philosophical and practical challenges to attaining this goal of reparatory justice. Although several groups have received reparations payments, and some of those were covered by Ambassador Omar, the French enslavers extracting reparations from Haiti, the British enslavers who received 20 million pounds in cash and then another 27 million in free labor during their apprenticeship, and more recent payouts like to the Japanese Americans and to the Jews. In light of these, it really does beg the question, why not reparations for people of African descent? Why is there almost an automatic pushback from people both within the region as well as outside the Caribbean excuse me, that this is not possible for people of African descent. Ms. Tendai Achume, the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism, maintains in her 2019 report to the United Nations that it is lack of political will and moral courage on the part of those countries who benefited. However, Professor Beckles asserts that fundamentally, Europe believes that the descendants of the enslaved have no rights and are simply undeserving of an apology and reparatory justice. In other words, Black lives really do not matter. The same racist philosophy that stymies the general advancement of people of African descent challenges the very notion of reparations for those against whom crime against humanity have been committed. Another major challenge is youth involvement in the reparations claim. As we know, for any mass movement to be successful, young people have to be educated, engaged, and fully on board. The baton must be continually passed until the objective is realized. And while there has been some progress and initiatives such as a regional series of youth rallies and baton relays were organized by the Commission in 6 countries a few years ago, there is still much more work to be done. This continues, therefore, to be urgent. The Commission also recognizes that as much as it is critical for government and civil society to join forces to advance the reparations claim, there is some mistrust and a feeling that should there be a reparations payment, governments should not manage the funds. And of course, reparations goes beyond money, and it is a multidimensional claim. And of course, there are many ways in which we can get around that, but this sentiment does exist among some people. And then in the case of some governments, there is the ebb and flow in government policy on this issue, depending on the position of the political party in power and whether there's political pressure brought to bear on governments in diplomatic and donor relations, with the same states being pursued for reparations. It is a complexity that is being negotiated on a daily basis. Most recently with the visits of British royalty to the region on behalf of the Queen, notably to Belize, the Bahamas, and Antigua and Barbuda. There's also the pressing issue of insufficient resources being allocated by governments at the national and regional levels to pursue reparations with a degree of singularity of purpose that is required. And then there is the troubling narrative that is being amplified more and more in recent times, that Africans sold Africans into enslavement and an apology or even reparations is due from Africa. And this plays right into the anti-reparations agenda of Europe and negates the fact that Europe orchestrated this heinous trade and claimed the vast majority of benefits with a boom in shipping, insurance, and the genesis of the modern banking system, and unprecedented wealth to those connected to the trade, including the royal families, in stark contrast to the depopulation of Africa, the disruption of social, economic, and political systems, and the continued underdevelopment of many countries on the continent. And although it is true that there were some individual chiefs and African traders who got wealthy by collaborating with the Europeans, many subject to intimidation, bribery, and coercion, as Joseph Inikori, the Nigerian economic historian, and others have shown, the net profit to Africa on a whole was zero. Africans never accepted the capture, shipping, and enslavement without resistance in Africa, in the Middle Passage, and in the Caribbean. Many African kings and queens and communities put up major resistance to the trafficking of enslaved Africans, notably in the Upper Guinea region. King Alfonso of the Congo, Queen Anna Zinga Mbande of Angola was legendary in her fight against Portuguese slavers, having received military training as a young woman. And there are a lot of these stories that are not being told and are not known. And as the most honorable P.J. Patterson said at a CRC Reparations Forum in Antigua in 2014, and I quote, "There is no principle of law which permits the organizers of a criminal enterprise to escape responsibility because others collaborated in carrying out the enterprise. It was European nations who conceived the trade, put the enterprise into motion, controlled its operations, and were massively enriched by it," end quote. So a lot more work needs to be done to educate the people of the region and to address this damaging counter-narrative. Finally, there's the issue of inclusivity in the regional movement and building a broader coalition to advance the claim. The mandate given to the Commission was for Native genocide and slavery, but as Ambassador Omar has spoken to eloquently, there is the issue of indentureship, which is being looked at by the Commission. Heads of government also recognize that a strong coalition needs to be built with the African Union to strengthen the claim, and has written to the AU seeking collaboration following the first Africa CARICOM Summit of Heads of Government held in September last year. But colonial education here and in Africa is such that the slave trade and enslavement is not taught in African schools. And likewise, we in the Caribbean know very little of African history and traditions, including African royalty. It is therefore a major challenge, but vital to build this coalition with Africa. And we have already spoken to the partnership, the strong partnership with the National African American Reparations Commission. We now have a UN Permanent Forum of People of African Descent, and we're pursuing a strong collaboration with that body, especially we have two representatives from the Caribbean, Dr. June Sumo, and from St. Lucia, Ms. Gaynell Curry from the Bahamas, who sit on that forum. And we're also pursuing the CRC, a partnership with the IDO network of African kings and queens and chiefs in 11 African countries to bring the people of Africa and the Caribbean together. So in closing, let me say that it is only through coalitions like these mentioned, and also with the private sector, with youth, and not least of all with academia, with all of you who are gathered here in this plenary session, that reparations will ultimately be realized for the people of the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brown. From Dr. Brown in Jamaica, we now jump to Europe, Switzerland in particular, to Hans Fassler, an historian and activist from the Saint-Gallen area of Switzerland, and the founder of the Swiss Committee on Reparations for Slavery. Hans Fassler will start off with a look at the slavery reparations issue from a European perspective, and then move on to Switzerland and its colonial past. And he will argue why the CARICOM Reparations Initiative is of such importance to Switzerland and vice versa. Hans, you have the floor.
First, I would like to say thank you to the organizers of this conference. D'abord, j'aimerais remercier les organisateurs de cette conférence. Thanks, Chair, and thanks to my co-panelists. My first part will be a European response to the reparation question. And this is, of course, a difficult job for a little Swiss historian like me, to give a European perspective. Europe is a continent, and I'm just a Swiss historian. So much, I would argue, is going on in the UK, in France, Holland, Germany, Belgium, Scandinavia, that it is very demanding to keep tracks of all the campaigns, research projects, publications, debates, and grassroots activities. But let me try my best looking at Europe before providing some information about the peculiarities of the Swiss positions and the opportunities for the CARICOM reparations campaign therein. Reparations for slavery, I'm afraid to say, are presently not very high up on the European agendas. But coming to terms with aspects of the colonial past is very much so. I want to mention three fields of ongoing debate, which are sometimes interrelated. Field one, the debate about the restitution of colonial objects, human remains, and looted artifacts to their countries of origin. The debate was launched, as you will all know, by President Macron of France in his Dakar speech of 2017, and there were repercussions in Germany. In Germany, the Humboldt Forum in Berlin was being built and reopened, and in Switzerland, where Swiss museums have a great number of Benin bronzes. Field two, the debate about genocides, massacres, and colonial wars. In Germany, about the Namibian genocide against the Ova Herero and Nama people of 1904 to 1908, and the Maji Maji War in Tanzania, 1905 to 1907. In Belgium, about the murderous and genocidal regime of Leopold II in the Congo, 1885 to 1908. In Britain, about the punitive expedition against Benin City in 1897. Field three, the debate about sites of memory sweeping through most of Europe in the wake of the killing of George Floyd in May 2020. It has resulted in hundreds of monuments in most European countries being destroyed, toppled, removed, daubed, or put into question. And in dozens of streets and squares and mountains and buildings being renamed or contextualized. In all of these three fields, incidentally, I notice a tendency to no longer avoid comparisons and parallels between the horrors of slavery and colonialism and the horrors of Nazism and the Holocaust. Comparing, of course, is not equating, but I would argue that the taboo, never ever put these two in relation, has gone. Now, how should we judge and interpret the relevance and the impact of the debates I have just sketched? They could be seen as mere distractions from the real thing, from the big one, European reparations for transatlantic slavery. Or they could be regarded as intellectual training grounds for coming to terms with the crime of slavery, preparing European societies, nations, and public opinion for what will be inevitable in the 21st century, the century of reparatory justice. I am carefully and optimistically leaning towards the latter interpretation. And I herein draw some hope from the example of the UK, where institutions from the Royal Bank of Scotland and Glasgow University to Lloyd's of London and the brewery Green King are considering slavery reparations. Having said that, I want to add 4 caveats, or not pessimistic, but rather more realistic assessments of the situation. 1, although Spain established the first murderous colonial empire, murderous for the indigenous population of the Americas and for the enslaved Africans that were meant to replace them, and was the number 2 in the slave trade even before the British, and although Portugal accounted for almost half of all the slaves traded across the Atlantic, the debate on the Iberian Peninsula is strangely lagging behind the rest of Europe, perhaps with the exception of Catalonia. 2, the attack of Putin's Russia on Ukraine and the ongoing war, just a 3 hours flight from where I am right now, are threatening to overshadow or silence the colonial debate. Eduardo Galeano, journalist from Uruguay, you may have heard of his groundbreaking book, The Open Veins of Latin America, gave an interview in 1991. This was tellingly 2 years after the falling of the Berlin Wall and 1 year before the Columbus year. Galeano said that the Berlin Wall had died a good death without even reaching the age of 30, while that other wall would soon celebrate its 500th birthday. I think we will have to do all we can, like with the present conference, to prevent the new East-West dimension from eclipsing the North-South one. 3, there was a chance of staggering new alliances in Europe in the summer of 2020 between Black Lives Matter, a very young and diverse movement, the old left, social democratic and socialist parties, ecological parties and movements, post-colonial activists, trade unions, and the Youth for Climate and Climate Justice, a movement which was well aware of the colonial and post-colonial aspect of climate change with the global North's imperial lifestyle. There was a window of opportunity for such an alliance, but then came the second wave of COVID-19, and then the third, and then the window was closed. We need to reopen it. And 4, the CARICOM reparation campaign launched in 2013 was, in my opinion, the most solidly founded, best prepared, and best documented of all international campaigns for slavery reparations that I have come across in 20 years of studying and analyzing that field. Nevertheless, the traces of the demand to enter into negotiations addressed to Britain, Holland, Spain, Portugal, France, etc., are few and far between in Europe. And this is where Switzerland comes in. The special and not so special case of Switzerland. Switzerland is a newcomer to the colonial debate. Until 2000, hardly anyone in Switzerland would have linked their country to Atlantic slavery, the slave trade, colonial exploitation, and to anti-Black racism. But dozens of studies, books, articles, essays, lectures, colloquiums, conferences, and research projects have made it irrefutable over the last 20 years. Swiss individuals, Swiss banks, Swiss merchant families, Swiss mercenaries, Swiss intellectuals, Swiss trading companies were involved. Opening up colonies, investing in triangular expeditions, insuring slave ships, investing in colonial companies, trading and speculating in colonial goods, trading in slaves, owning or directing or administrating plantations with slaves, securing colonies, and maintaining slavery by military means, by trivializing or justifying slavery, or by elaborating anti-Black racism. The focus areas of Swiss involvement in colonial exploitation and slavery were the Guyanas, Berbice, Essequibo, Demerara, Suriname, and French Guiana, Saint-Domingue, Martinique, Guadeloupe, British North America and the USA, Cuba, and Brazil. I have estimated the Swiss share of the total transatlantic slavery system at 3%, which, if you look at it per capita, is higher than that of France. This was my message to the CARICOM Reparations Commission when we met in Antigua in 2019. The CRC was apparently convinced, and so was The Guardian in an article published on the subject in November 2020. The CRC put Switzerland on the list of countries to be addressed for slavery reparations and drafted the letter to the Swiss government. But that letter has not yet arrived, because apparently the consent of the Caribbean heads of government is still lacking. So if anyone is listening and watching now who has anything to do with decision-making among Caribbean heads of state and governments, or among the members of the PMSC, the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations, headed by Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados, please hear my call. See to it that this letter is signed and posted as soon as possible. That letter would be a game changer for us in the Swiss colonial debate. And the relevance of that letter for Switzerland is not even its first and foremost. There is a fair chance that the letter might revitalize CARICOM's reparation cause in Europe as a whole. Switzerland, I argue, is very much embedded in this continent with a highly developed press and media system closely linked to the German and the French press for linguistic reasons, and also covered by the British press. If Switzerland is targeted as a colonial profiteer or a free rider of the European colonial system, there will be a certain European logic of thinking. If even Switzerland is in it, then the whole of Europe must be and should be. So I expect a good press coverage and a good dissemination of the story of that letter in the European media. And I have reasons to believe that Switzerland could be exemplary in dealing with the CARICOM demand fairly, justly, and decently, a role model, hopefully, for those European countries who have apparently more or less snubbed the nations of the Caribbean by their responses or non-responses to the slavery demand letters. And finally, one last argument why Switzerland is so ready and prepared for that letter. In 2020, based on a suggestion made in the press conference in Antigua the year before, I founded SCORES, the Swiss Committee on Reparations for Slavery. So far, 100 white Swiss personalities from all walks of life have signed the minimal consensus, which demands spiritual as well as material reparations for slavery by Switzerland, and which insists that those reparations must be the negotiated result of a dialogue between the descendants of those who profited from the slavery system and the descendants of the victims. The committee is, for all I know, unique in Europe. Mind you, CARICOM, 100 men and women from academia, politics, literature, the arts, the churches, the media, and the trade unions are waiting for your demand letter. Please do not let them down. Thank you.
Chair, you're muted.
All right. As I said, thank you very much, Hans. We hear your call, and we will certainly convey your urgent message to the CARICOM heads of government, and in particular to the regional subcommittee. So thank you very much for that update. Our final panelist, sisters and brothers, is Eric Phillip, chairperson of the Guyana Reparations Committee and a vice chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. Eric is also an executive member of the African Cultural and Development Association and was the first president of the African Business Roundtable in Guyana. He was managing director for AT&T Africa and the Middle East and lived in South Africa for 7.5 years before returning to Guyana in 2005. He is a former White House Fellow and has been featured on the cover of Business Week International and Black Engineering magazines. Eric Phillip is the co-author of the Guyana 21 and Guyana 2030 plans, both blueprints for Guyana's national development. In his presentation, Brother Phillip will cover some of the nuances, contradictions, and issues facing the Caribbean reparations movement today, using Guyana, his homeland, as an example. Eric, you have the floor.
Thank you, Don. As an engineer, you would assume that I may be uncomfortably direct in what I have to say. Hello, everyone. Sustainable development in the Caribbean has been contextualized by many United Nations initiatives, the Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, and now, of course, the new paradigms are centered around COP26 agreements, climate change, and global warming. Yes, the world is going green, except for the Caribbean, perhaps, who are going red, or worse yet, maybe going broke. The global West and the developed nations of the United Nations fake ignorance when they seek to distance themselves from the fundamental fact that without reparations, Caribbean civilization will not be able to sustain itself or grow in a sustainable manner. They know this, and they love the dependency of the Caribbean on the IMF and other institutions. In the Caribbean, because of our unique ability to lie to ourselves and to deceive each other, we collectively hide from the reality that reparations are the moral, social, psychological, cultural, religious, economic, health, political, and financial crises of our times, and will be with us for quite a while. Our politicians have unanimously created the CRC, but seem to be hesitant to focus in a real way on the most pressing issue facing the Caribbean, which is linked to reparations. And that is, reparatory justice is critical to Caribbean development. We still haven't learned the COVID-19 lessons. The great Indian novelist and social activist, Arundhati Roy, tried to help us to understand the opportunity COVID-19 offered us when she wrote, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to reimagine another world and ready to fight for it." One of the nuances of Caribbean reparatory justice is that we in the Caribbean still haven't reimagined our world. We're still pursuing Western conditionalities of growth and stagnation, debt and debt relief. Unlike the Caribbean, the European Union of 26 countries speaking 24 languages, and with dozens of brutal wars and several holocausts among themselves, formed a political and economic union for their sustainable growth, while our Caribbean leaders seem to play dolly house politics supported by ethnic and class strategies and have not realized we need to come together. Even with the unanimous agreement to pursue reparations by our heads of states, and we have a new open portal, we seem to be bashful about walking through it. Likewise, intellectuals in our region, with minds that were partly cultivated by colonial influences through our education, media, religious orientations, pontificate on several critical issues pertaining to preparatory justice, but advocate for nothing, signaling a profound lack of commitment to justice. For justice is a synonym for reparations. It appears as if honoring the sacrifice and memories of our ancestors is an unbearable burden and not a symbol of love and respect for them. So, for example, many academics waste their emotional energy and disrespect our ancestors by turning the European slave trade into the African slave trade. We've seen the public debate about selling Africans into slavery, and Dr. Hilary Brown spoke about it. Well, my fellow countrymen and women, I doubt the 3,000 tribes who spoke 2,000 different languages that lived on the continent of Africa during that time saw themselves as Africans or from Africa. Rather, tribes sold other tribes, having been rewarded with guns and trinkets, threatened to be enslaved by Europeans who had massive military superior weapons and who nurtured wars while building forts along the west coast of Africa to take away their property. No, it was not the African slave trade. It was the European slave trade or the Christian slave trade. In the same way that there was an Arab slave trade or Muslim slave trade that went on for 11 centuries that we seem to ignore as academics. With these two nuances of the Caribbean reparatory justice out of the way, let me address some of the challenges, contradictions, and inconvenient truths of the reparation movement in the Caribbean. There's a famous statement by Charles Dickens that charity begins at home. One of the inconvenient truths of reparations in the Caribbean is that reparations should begin at home. Our Rastafari community knows this pain. Do you know, if you look at it intellectually, Jews paid Jews for the Holocaust and then used their influence to obtain a homeland in Israel. Yes, Jewish influence in the UK, Jewish influence in the United States, Jewish influence in other parts of the world allowed Jews to influence payment for the Holocaust. In essence, Jews influenced Jews and others to pay for the Holocaust. Europeans created a Marshall Plan for Europeans. Charity begins at home. The USA and Europe printed money to address the COVID-19 economic freefall in their countries. Charity begins at home. The British gave reparations to 46,000 different British claimants. Charity begins at home. Haiti was held hostage by France, and the US paid France on behalf of Haiti. And since then, the US has kept Haiti hostage, even taking away all their gold to the USA and now controlling what happens in Haiti. Again, charity begins at home, depending on where your home is. My question, therefore, is, shouldn't reparations begin at home? Let me use the Guyana situation. Guyana is the only country in the world with a reparatory justice bill. Yes. Passed in 2006, 40 years after Guyana became independent in 1966, the Parliamentary Act, called the Amerindian Act of 2006, gave 70,000 Amerindians from 9 tribes, 13.8% of Guyana's landmass. This is 6,015 square miles. It also gave them an Amerindian Development Fund, a Tashaus Council, which currently has over 200 leaders, and an Amerindian Ministry, which gets about 8% of national budget. Of course, everyone in the Caribbean and Guyana seemed to have forgotten that Africans indigenized Guyana and that 473,000 died to build the country. Yes, 473,000. While Amerindians who received reparatory justice were protected by both the British and Dutch law and worked as hunters of maroons or runaway Africans. So remember that reparatory justice should belong to all of those who have been impaired. By the way, the 13.8% given to Amerindians is very significant, as Guyana is 430 times the size of Barbados and 20 times the size of Jamaica. But what is the claim of the Guyana Reparations Committee? Well, as part of the terms of reference from the CARICOM Reparations Commission, we wrote a document addressing the TOR linking past discrimination to present-day inequality. And we identified 15 discriminatory steps that were implemented by the Guyana state, whether Dutch or British or independent Guyana, which have resulted in the poverty of African Guyanese and has left tremendous legacy impact still dominant in the African community. These inequalities are so visible now in terms of generational wealth that today African Guyanese have no ability to participate in Guyana's greatest patrimony, the oil sector, patrimony. while others who were paid as indentures and given land now reap that benefit. And our reparations claim is simple. Slavery was a crime against humanity, and international law, as well as morality, dictates that there should be reparations. As I mentioned earlier, 473,000 Africans died to build Guyana during 200 years of enslavement. And whilst they were dying, they cleared 15,000 square miles, or 18% of Guyana. That's larger than all the Caribbean islands combined. And yet, the government of Guyana, 40 years after independence, granted financial and land reparations to Amerindian tribes, but fails to do that today. More importantly, as a legal position, 3 of the 9 Amerindian tribes that were given lands under the Amerindian Lands Act of 2006, the Waiwais, the Makushis, the Wapishanas, came to Guyana 100 to 200 years after Africans were brought here. So groups who came here long after Africans were here, groups who were given all sorts of benefits, groups who were given lots of additional benefits after emancipation, such as being paid, have gotten reparatory justice, but African Guyanese have not. We seem to forget why. In 1838, Guyana had a population of roughly 98,000. By 1917, through indentureship, 238,000 Indians arrived from India, and only 76,000 returned. So since that time, there's almost been a 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 difference in population. And because of our Westminster winner-take-all system, the proof is in the pudding. The results are what they are. Africans are underrepresented. Africans do not get much from the government, and the generational wealth continues. Just to give you an example, after indentureship, each indenture was given 2 acres, plus an additional 2-acre plot land per child over 10 years, and half an acre to a child under 10. Each indenture family also received half an acre to build a house. So a family of 6 could have received a grant of 12.5 acres, while Africans who died to build Guyana received nothing. This has continued throughout the history of Guyana. Our historians forget to mention the East Indian colonization scheme, where Guyana was offered to India as a colony. That document exists, but no one speaks about it. During Gaisuku's crisis, 11,000 house lots were given to Indians. Out of the 7 oil blocks that were given away to Guyanese, 6 went to Indians, 1 went to Portuguese. So the people who have died to build Guyana keep receiving nothing. So what are the issues and the nuances and the contradictions? Should African Guyanese file for reparations for 18% of Guyana, which is equivalent to 15,000 square miles? We believe so, and an ancestral rights bill and a perpetual fund document has already been written. Should the government of Guyana or Africans manage their reparatory justice process or assets because of the racial divide in the country? Another issue, would African Guyanese receiving reparations in Guyana catalyze or hinder the Caribbean reparations program with Europe? Are these contradictions or nuances even being discussed in CARICOM or among academia? The question is, why should Europeans give the Caribbean reparations when the Caribbean itself would not give itself reparations? These are some of the nuances and the challenges. So in summarizing, I would say in an honorable and moral quest for reparatory justice, many issues, nuances, and contradictions exist. How we in the Caribbean treat Haiti or Haitians as criminals or nomads exposes our insincerity to reparatory justice. Just another nuance. We want justice or reparations, but we continue to ignore injustices in our individual societies. We want unified action on reparatory justice, but plead plausible deniability about the despicable silence of the ethnic divide in Guyana and the right to reparatory justice for Guyanese of African descent. We want to speak truth to power about slavery and indigenous genocide, but refuse to teach it in our school systems because we are somewhat political cowards and are not interested in teaching whom or what Europeans really did or are, as we willingly continue to perish under their global Bretton Woods squeeze. We want a mass movement in civil society so that there's national momentum for reparatory justice, but refuse to acknowledge the massive role of one of the largest groups in civil society, the church, and the role they played in slavery, the three papal bulls, which legitimized slavery that we seem to forget, and which created chattel slavery. We want justice for reparations, but we still embrace legacy systems such as the Westminster system and the winner-take-all system when we are teaching and preaching unity and a unified approach to Caribbean development. We want political autonomy or republicanism for our countries, but keep institutions and business practices dictated by historical enemies that are subjected to their laws. Some crap, as in the case of Exxon, about sanctity of contracts. Aren't we ashamed of being cursed while we utter those words and utter God Save the Queen? We want to speak truth about slavery and indigenous genocide, but refuse to teach it in our school systems. Where are we? We are almost at the end of the International Decade of People of African Descent, whose theme is recognition, justice, and development. This theme seems to have been lost in most Caribbean leaders, most academics, and most countries. We seem to be the only ones not aware of the decade. So these nuances, these issues, these contradictions exist within the Caribbean Reparations Program. I close with an anecdote because it's important for us. There's a person called Fishhooks. And as the story goes, he was a devout Catholic. So devout he was that every morning on his way to church to do his political work, he stopped at one of the priests, fell on his knees, and whispered the simple prayer, "O Lord, give me health and strength. The rest I'll steal." I hope we understand that reparatory justice is critical to Caribbean development and that we should stop praying and hoping about it. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Philip. Eric Philip from Guyana. Thanks for that provocative, no holds barred, no punches held back, but a very stimulating presentation. Thank you very much, Eric. We will come back to you shortly. Sisters and brothers in the audience, many thanks to all our panelists for their brilliant and stimulating presentations. Let's give them a collective virtual applause. Now let's move to the Q&A section of this plenary. I will start off with a question posed to each panelist, and then we will open up the plenary to questions from the virtual audience. The ground rules are simple. Please raise your virtual hand to be recognized. Keep your question or comment as brief as possible and address it to any individual panelist or to the group as a whole. So let me get the ball rolling with a question to Ambassador Omar. You are a well-known and respected cultural artist yourself. So can you elaborate on the role of grassroots culture in the reparations movement in Guyana, in particular, the involvement of the Calypso community and the involvement of the Rastafari community in your country?
I certainly can, Don, but I hope you're not pinning me to Guyana. I think Eric handles that quite well.
No, did I say Guyana? Senior moment. Antigua and Barbuda. I'm sorry about that.
Well, yeah, let me deal with two aspects, the Rastafari aspect and the contributions of artists, grassroots. movements, cultural movements in the region. The TORs of the Antigua and Barbuda Reparations Commission sort of makes specific mention that Rastafari should be represented on the commission. Over the years, we've had two Rastafari elders sharing with us in the commission. Unfortunately, one died in December of last year. One is incapacitated in a certain way. So we are presently approaching the community for new representation on the Reparations Commission itself. This means that over the years, that both organizations, the movement, Rastafari movement, and the Reparations organization have worked very, very close with each other. Rastafari have participated in all our events, bringing their cultural performances, cultural presentations, their cultural attributes, in food, and music, and drumming in particular, as part of our celebrations. The other strong area of cultural contribution to the movement is actually come from the Calypso fraternity here, and we go back a long way with this. I mean, there again references to reparations, although the word is not used in that sense, in the Antiguan music as far back as the mid-1970s. And since then, through a number of artists, and within the last 4 or 5 years, for sure, maybe even longer, within the last 8 to 10 years, that there is virtually no year, I would think, of Calypso performances here in Antigua without the issue of reparations being put on stage in our music. My close association, of course, with the Calypso fraternity, I hope has encouraged some of that, and it is really, really very active. We have seen also in the theater a number of really important pieces being staged quite recently. Again, fashion. In fashion, we're also seeing contributions, at least of African dress, African culture, within the ambit of our reparations program. So I say yes, down here in Antigua, that there is quite vibrant cooperation and participation in aspects of reparations and the reparations movement, specifically in the event stage by the commission.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador Omar. Turning now to Dr. Hilary Brown. In your presentation, you outlined a number of challenges facing the reparations movement in the Caribbean today. How would you prioritize those challenges, and what efforts are being made to engage the region's youth with the reparations movement?
Okay, thanks, Don. Yes, as I had indicated in the presentation, we have challenges at the philosophical level, as well as some of the practical challenges. And I think Dorbreen also alluded to some of them, in terms of, whereas it's a positive that you have a prime ministerial subcommittee that is actively engaged on this matter, it also does have its challenges in terms of decision-making and being able to react and to respond to various developments in the reparations movement. And certainly I would want to assure Hans that at the most recent meeting of heads of government in February, the intersessional, the chair of the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee, who is Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, she actually raised that in the meeting to say she wants to send off these 10 letters, which includes Switzerland, and gave everyone a deadline to give their final comments on the draft. I know they are with her now. I actually need to double check to see if she has actually dispatched them. But certainly last year, as the chair of the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee, she sent off letters to the African Union, to the Congressional Black Caucus in the US, and also to the government of India, to Prime Minister Modi. All of those requesting collaboration. So let me say though, in terms of youth, as I said in the presentation, this is really critical. And as we know, our young people need to be educated. If we invite them to a forum like this, if they've never heard of reparations or they don't see the relevance or the importance, they're not going to come. And although, you know, it is often said, oh, you have to reach the youth through social media, you can only use social media after you have educated them. And I have found that where you do take that time, and that's where the partnerships with academia, with ensuring that history is taught in schools, and I know CXC is working towards making it compulsory, working with governments to have that made compulsory. The CRC also recently published in January of this year a special CAPE resource guide for students doing history at CAPE level, published by the UA Press. So the education really is key. I think only in Guyana, we have a Youth for Reparations group called Ikemba. And I worked along very closely with that group. They're established, they are very enthusiastic, they would like to go regional. And I think there's a lot of value in young people, in a peer-to-peer approach, young people reaching out to other young people. But it needs resources, it needs stronger collaboration with the national committees. So it's really about building from the ground up, country by country. And as I said, education really is very key. Once you've educated the young people, they're on board. They get it and they see the value and they're ready to take that baton.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brown. Let's now turn to Hans Fassler in Switzerland. And my question to Hans, well, first of all, Hans, we underscore the passion with which you called upon the CARICOM governments to re-engage more actively with the states in Europe. But how can CARICOM's demands on the former European slave states that profited handsomely from the Atlantic slave trade be strengthened in Europe itself at both the state and civil society levels?
Thank you, Don, for the question. I want to be very brief because I'm also interested in other people who have joined our meeting. If you had asked me in 2013 or 2014, what can be done to strengthen those demands from the European governments, I would have answered it's important once the letter has been sent to carry the question into the parliaments, because this is how you create a nationwide debate. So either you have contact with parliamentarians, members of parliament from African descent, certainly in Britain, they exist. In France, not too many. And then if this works, you have a national debate. Maybe it's now a bit late to try to do that because we're now almost a decade later. But if that letter to Switzerland is sent, and I'm very excited by the news I got from Hilary Brown that Comrade Prime Minister Mia Mottley has mentioned those letters. If that letter arrives in Switzerland, I can certainly guarantee you that I will do all I can, and I have a lot of contacts into Parliament, that it's not only something between the Swiss government and CARICOM, but it's something that will be debated in Parliament. So I'm waiting for that letter.
Okay, all right, duly noted. Thank you, Hans. And finally to Eric Phillip in Guyana with this question. The reparations narrative in the Caribbean has been focused heavily on reparations as a movement for regional development, and you spoke about that in your presentation, especially economic development. I'm wondering if you can elaborate your perspective on the economic logic of the reparations movement, particularly in the Caribbean region. Eric?
Thanks, Don. The 10-point plan is entrenched in a development framework. So it speaks to monetary payment, it speaks to debt cancellation, it speaks to technology transfer, it speaks to Indigenous Peoples Development Program, it speaks to illiteracy eradication, public health, etc. So collectively, we have both the software and hardware elements in the 10-point plan for development. The bigger issue, though, is our structure. Can the Caribbean be developed individually as small islands? The Caribbean, the 15 CARICOM countries cover 177,000 square miles, has 18 million people, lots of different governance systems. It also includes Haiti that has 11 million people. So if we're going to use this as a development framework, we have to have holistic planning. We have to have a different architecture than individual presidents and prime ministers working on their own nation states. We just had an agri-investment forum in Guyana that was attended by 7 other prime ministers because we have a food security issue. That's the way we have to approach this. We have to look at the European Union to see how they've addressed their issues. If we're dealing with Barbados issues, and then Antigua issues, and then Jamaica issues, I think we'll miss the problem. We'll miss the fact that reparations is a moral, social, economic, psychological, political, medical issue. We have to look at everything holistically. And even though it's embedded in an economic development framework, it's also about how we treat each other, how we love each other, how we buy from each other, how we stop whitening our skins. So we have to self-heal as part of this reparatory justice process. And so it's both economic and social and cultural and political, etc.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to read some key arguments that underpin CARICOM's case against Europe and speaks to the economic and historical logic of reparations. These sentences are from Professor Hilary Beckles, chairman of the CARICOM Reparations Commission and the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, and author of the recent book, How Britain Underdeveloped the Caribbean. If you have not gotten your hand on this book, I would heartily recommend that you do. To quote Dr. Beckles, Professor Beckles, we are now in a time of global reckoning for centuries of crimes against humanity, perpetrated by European colonial powers as they built their empires with the wealth extracted from the territories they occupied and exploited with enslaved and later indentured labor. The systematic brutality of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and the plantation economies did not disappear with the abolition of slavery. Rather, the means of exploitation were reconfigured to ensure that wealth continued to flow from the Caribbean to European states. Independence from colonial powers in the 20th century did not mean real freedom for the Caribbean nations, left as they were without the resources for meaningful development and in a state of persistent poverty. Professor Beckles focuses his attention on the British colonial mess, as he calls it, in the Caribbean region and shows how successive governments have systematically suppressed economic development in their former colonies and have refused to accept responsibility for the debt and development support they owe the region. Hilary Beckles' new book, How Britain Underdeveloped the Caribbean. Now let's move to the audience and take the first question. Please identify yourself and your location if you so choose. Click on the hand icon at the bottom of the screen and I will recognize you in order. Go right ahead. I don't see any hands up. I don't see any hands up. You can go to the bottom of your screen under reactions. Michael Bennett, right? Yes, Mr. Bennett, go right ahead, please. Do you have a question or a comment? You'll need to unmute. There you go. Go right ahead.
Right. Thank you, Don. So Dr. Michael Barnett here, talking to you from Jamaica, a member of the National Council on Reparations here in Jamaica. Very interesting presentations from all the panelists, very provocative. My question is, the CARICOM Reparations Commission has joined forces with the reparations movement in the US. What are the thoughts about joining forces with continental Africans? Because it was mentioned that under colonialism, actually Africans had suffered greatly themselves, although we don't equate it with chattel slavery, but it could be argued the Congo, in Namibia, the Africans really suffered the kind of brutality and torture that we suffered in the West under the transatlantic slave trade. So what are the thoughts about having a global reparations movement with our brothers and sisters on the continent itself? I want to get the panelists' perspectives on that, all perspectives as well.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Barnett. It's good to see and hear you, my brother. Let's first ask Dr. Hilary Brown to respond, and then we'll go quickly to the other panelists. Dr. Brown?
Okay, thanks, Don, and thanks so much, Dr. Barnett, for that question. Very important point, and links back in with the discussion, well, with some of the points I made about building coalitions for success. The African link is critical. I would, for my own part, would love to see a global reparations forum. You know, a forum that brings together academics, persons in international agencies, governments, and one driven, you know, by us, in the South. I have, over the last year or so, met various African academics. There was one, excuse me, one initiative where we were working together to design a project proposal for funding. And these well-respected academics in an institute in Kenya said they knew nothing of reparations. We have been working, as I mentioned, with the IDO network of kings and queens, because again, they're interested in reaching out to the diaspora, and they feel that that initiative should come from the people, and they see themselves as the traditional leaders and as the people's leaders. And so they feel that appropriately, they should reach out to the diaspora. And so they're having a delegation going to Missouri in August, and we're trying to also arrange for a delegation of African kings and queens to come to the region. But at every step, and I think even Dobreen could speak to his Africa Day lecture last week, we had again another very respected academic, and he said he had not heard of reparations or even the trade in enslaved Africans until he reached university. So there is a serious knowledge gap. It's going to take a lot of work, but I think that's an important thing to do. And I saw in the chat too, Don, a question about what would be the role of CSA. And yes, I could see the Caribbean Studies Association. I don't know to what extent we have links with academics in Africa, but I could see where this forum, you know, could play a role in that as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Quickly, Ambassador Omar, your answer to the question.
Yes, I think we need to also look at the history within the development of a reparations movement to find answers or to find possibilities about Dr. Barnett's suggestion. We go back to, let's say, 2001, and I think it's important that we note that African countries joined with Europe, at least governments joined with Europe against the call for reparations, against the declaration that slavery was a crime against humanity. That took place in the government forum. However, in the NGO forum, African NGOs were on board. And I think that right now the CRC is very, very clear of pursuing its connections, both in NGOs and with governments. There has been some good response, political overtures coming from Kenya, political overtures coming from Ghana, about the possibility of staging international reparations forum this year. I think we're still waiting to hear, because one was proposed for the beginning of August. I don't think we have received any details about that. The connections that have been established clearly between Prime Minister Mia Mottley, her address at Ghana's 50th anniversary of independence. My maths it might be a bit off, but her recent address at the celebrations of Ghana's independence, where reparations put on the table before that. So I think, Dr. Barnett, that there are things in process. Some of these things perhaps they take a little longer than you and I would really like to come to fruition. But we're quite aware, at least in the CRC, about the need for this global reparations movement, and particularly with major African contributions in it.
Thank you, Brother Dobreen. Brother Eric?
Yes, just to add to what Dr. Barnett asked, we've been engaged with the African Union, we've engaged Brazil, we've engaged Colombia, we've engaged groups in the United Kingdom. Of course, Hans is on here. We definitely need a global movement to get the momentum necessary, and we're working on it.
Excellent. Hans, you unmute yourself. There you go.
Allow me to disagree slightly. When you were talking about the debate going on inside the CRC to enlarge the 10-point plan and to ask for reparations for colonialism, my inner reaction was keep it simple and straight. I think the beauty and the power of the CARICOM reparations campaign and movement as it was formulated in 2013 is that it's simple. Everybody understands it. And it's so important that you are able to convey the message to parliaments in Europe, to the public in Europe, to the media. You have a region which suffered from slavery, from transatlantic slavery, and we owe that region reparations. If you include all the horrors of colonialism, it'll just get too big, and then you will end up by adding all other injustices in the world, and you will be looking for allies all over the place, which is always good. But my impression is that it's better to keep it simple and straight. But I have to leave it up to you. You know more about Africa and alliances and how to raise money and how to raise funds. So this is just a spontaneous little Swiss reaction.
Thank you, Hans. I see we have two hands up, and I'm going to recognize first Anthazia Kadir, and then after that, Alicia Denise, with your question. You can direct the question to any member of the panel or to the panel as a whole. Anthazia, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Anthazia Kadir, are you hearing us? All right, we can come back to you in a minute. Alicia Denise, can you ask your question, please? All right. What about?
Can they unmute themselves, or do they need help?
They have to unmute themselves. I think they understand that. Mm-hmm. Or maybe the there you go.
There we go.
Oh.
Okay,
yes,
sorry for that. I
go
cannot
ahead.
unmute myself. I'm one, anyways. as an educator in the region, every time I come to one of these conferences, I get excited when I hear about getting the youth involved and academia involved. My question is, and this is purely subjective in terms of where is the support to do this kind of work. Currently, I'm situated in the Caribbean and I'm proposing to reimagine pedagogy and curriculum and bringing the reparation movement into the classroom. But where is the support to do the work in terms of the wider community, getting CARICOM involved, for example? Now, I know that CARICOM is doing a lot of work and the reparation community is doing a lot of work. But tangibly, to do the work on the ground, I am not seeing that support there. And I continue to propose and to work through these challenges the best way that I can. In terms of, that's the first one. In terms of collaboration with Africa, probably my colleagues in the US can attest to this. There is a Professor Dildar who takes teachers to the continent and through storying and being and living in the villages and coming back to the US and sharing that experience with others in the US and trying to have this awareness movement going on. I'm wondering if it's something like that, that kind of collaboration can bring that liberatory pedagogy, storying, different type of pedagogy that we want to see that connects to this reparation movement. If that is something that can work, and or probably there are conversations that are happening that I'm not privy to. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Khadi, for that question. Any responses? Dr. Brown first, and maybe Ambassador Omar after. Dr. Brown, unmute.
Sorry, thank you. Yes, that's a really very weighty and important question. I think too, as I said in my presentation, the resources are scarce. We're not even going to pretend that we have the level of support that we need to. Our governments have made a contribution to a regional budget, but of course it isn't anywhere near it needs to be. And so I think that it is through partnerships like with the CSA, because I agree that the work needs to happen at the grassroots level. And our national committees, the regional commission are already stretched. I mean, you know, just discussing the expansiveness of the agenda, reaching out to Africa, reaching out to youth, addressing women's issues, the kind of research. It is a huge undertaking. It is a huge undertaking. And so I think the partnerships are good. And we know that academics are very good at raising grants and raising funds to get research done and so on, very creative. And so I think it is that kind of partnership. But I guess that what we need, and I saw another comment in the chat about the need for the grassroots to organize from the bottom up. So we need leadership within the grassroots, within academia, to say we would like to do this, and then to connect with the Reparations Commission or with a national committee to move it ahead, because we just don't have enough human resources on the CRC to really do it all effectively.
Yes, thank you. Ambassador Omar, your comment?
Additional comments, Don, except, I mean, the question opens up some considerations that are presently on my mind about the 10-point plan and how we perceive it. As I said in my presentation, it sort of identifies areas that reparations payments will be expended within. But what we're hearing now is that for instance, the idea of youth participation is something that is targeted in the 10-point plan, but we are now noticing that that involvement needs to take place as part of the approach to reparations. So it exists, you know, before reparations and after reparations settlement. And I think the question is asking us, how do we deal with youth involvement prior to reparations settlements, as opposed to the perception in the 10-point plan that those issues will be addressed post the reparations payment. I think this is also true for a number of other areas in the 10-point plan, where not that the things that we have identified as areas in which we can spend money on post reparations, that we need to be spending money on them now as part of the movement to reparations. And I think that this youth issue is one of them. I think Dr. Brown has clearly pointed to the resource shortages in the CRC. I think all of us involved in CRC are full-time engaged in other areas of making a living. I mean, and this is something I think we need to address in the CRC. As to how do we organize to go forward, as this work clearly is becoming more and more intense, and is this something that can be left, you know, to part-time participation of all the chairpersons of national committees and the members of national committees, etc.
Right, Eric, do you have a comment?
Yes, Don, it's more fundamental than that. We don't teach history in our schools. How do we expect our youth to hear or know anything about reparations? It is that fundamental. We can't mobilize people by going to educate them now when there's no core information in the school system that they spend years in. So I think we need to go back to basics and deal with teaching history in our schools. At the University of Guyana, where I teach, there's no person studying history. Can you imagine that? The media is just as foolish about reparations. They go after these tangential issues because there's no core information that they received in schools. So once we do that, we can mobilize our youth and our academics can have something to work with. So it's more fundamental than that. We need to start teaching history.
Okay, I don't think you'll get a nay on that from any of us on this panel. Let me just take a question from the chat, from Nicholas Watts. And this question is to all of the panelists. He says, the Commonwealth heads of government are about to meet in Rwanda at the end of the month. The UK is the only European colonial power that will be present at that meeting, but is obviously a key target to members of the panel. Do members of the panel see the Commonwealth heads of government meeting as a possible useful forum to bring up the issue of reparations? Who wants to go first? Dr. Brown? And then maybe followed by Hans. Let's go to Hans Fassler first, and then to Dr. Brown. Hans?
I don't think, I'm afraid I have anything intelligent to say answering that question. I think this is for the other panelists. Thank you.
Okay.
May I comment?
Yes, go right ahead.
Brexit is driving the UK to do many different things to reconstitute their kingdom like the Commonwealth. I think it's critical at a meeting such as this that the issue of reparations be raised. It might be the right environment to start having the UK understand it has obligations from the past if it wants to engage the Commonwealth to get their assets and their business in the future. So it's an opportune situation to bring the issue up.
And if I could add to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think we can ignore any opportunity at all to put this before Europe. I hear our leaders in this region talking about attending the Summit of the Americas because they recognize perhaps the injustices of not inviting Venezuela and Cuba, etc. But they see the forum as an opportunity that they can talk directly to the United States about their concerns. And I think that the same approach can be taken to the Commonwealth. It is an ideal opportunity, I would think, for our leaders to raise these issues.
Yes. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Doreen. We are running out of time, sisters and brothers, so we'll probably only be able to take one more question from the audience. And I see a hand up. Is it Chenzira Kahina? Chenzira Kahina. Could you please ask your question? You'll have to unmute. There you go. Go right ahead, please.
Greetings, everyone. This has been a very informative and engaging platform. I just wanted to share that there are so many different elements to how we handle the building blocks within reparations that it would be very wise for us to incorporate the communitarian grassroots, non-governmental organizations, civil society networks, as we're making these statements about what is not happening in the reparations movement. The CARICOM Reparations Commission gives us an opportunity to tighten up things as we move beyond 2022. And of course, as the forthcoming CSA president, our EC that is really strong on this particular area, do intend to incorporate all of the recommendations shared, all of the research that is made available. And I'd like to ask every panelist and the moderator to assist us in being able to do so most productively. Not a question, just a request. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to entertain one final question. I see a hand up by Okama Ekpe. Okama Ekpe. Forgive me for mispronouncing your name, but can you go ahead and ask? Ooh, a lot of feedback there. Sorry about that. All right. Are there any, oh, there she is. All right. Go right ahead, please. You can unmute yourself.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now. Go right ahead.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. I really like to appreciate the panel for such a rich conversation. It provides us so many things to think about and plan moving forward. I think in terms of the Decade for People of African Descent, we would really like this panel, and of course with the CSA, to think about how the development aspect can be worked on in terms of reparations, reparatory justice. The Wheeler Institute in the UK did, early part of this year, a 3-month program, lectures, on looking at the development of Africa and the Caribbean from an economic lens. And looking at that from an economic lens actually provided opportunities to see how education involving our young scholars and having exchanges take place allowed for recommendations, very tangible recommendations to be made on how government, civil society organizations, educational institutions, the media, and philanthropic individuals could actually come together to provide the resources necessary to develop the infrastructure and the channels for trade, for logistics, for transportation to take place. Because those are the areas that are missing to really be able to develop Caribbean spaces and African spaces, for which we believe the reparatory justice can facilitate that process. So we're looking at development, and it would be great if your group can help us to find channels for that conversation to take place. And then we can take it on to the next level of what do we do for our people to move back and forth to do business with each other. Because while we're doing business with each other, we'll be able to develop those spaces and our people in those spaces while we're repatriating them back home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister Okama, for those comments. Sisters and brothers, unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I want to thank all of you in the audience who have joined us this morning. I hope you found this to be a fruitful discussion on reparations in the Caribbean region. I want to thank our panelists, Hans Fessler from Switzerland, Dr. Hilary Brown from the CARICOM Reparations Commission, Mr. Eric Phillip from the Guyana Committee, and Ambassador Dobreen Omar. Let us all give them a hearty round of applause. And I want to finally thank the Caribbean Studies Association for their kind invitation to us to participate in this morning's plenary. We wish you at the CSA much success with the rest of your conference, and let us keep in touch. Let us find ways to collaborate moving forward. As they say here in the United States, reparations now, forward ever, backward never. Good day all, bye-bye. Okay. Hillary, who is left?